Welcome back to this second video in the course of Philosophy and Metaphysics of Divination. Some of you may have checked out the file that I put in. It was a file by Stanislas de Gaeta. He's a much better writer in French than I am a translator, so I hope that was comprehensible, a read there. If you haven't had time to read it before, then you can read it after. It's definitely going to be very useful complementary information to what I'm about to go in. It's actually directly related. If you have any questions, just write them down, and I'll be happy to oblige either by video or by written answer. So the first thing that we need to consider when it comes to philosophy of divination is, what is the future? Now here's the thing. If divination is supposed to be kind of a study or a way to see into the future, well, what are we looking at? What are we trying to get into when we're divining? And you know, in practice, you know, everybody has their own little ideas what it means, and we don't always ask ourselves that question, but it's an important question to ask nonetheless. So I'll get into that right away. First, I'd like to say that when it comes to divination, it's an action that happens in the present. Therefore, it's not directly related to the future. So even if we have the preconception that the future is already 100% written out and that it is impossible to change, the divination experience still is something that is directly related to the present, and therefore cannot, as a present thing, also be in the future at the same time, so to speak. So what I'm saying is that divination is an isolated experience, or at least an experience which is anchored at the current time of the divination itself. It's something that happens within the context of the diviner, within the context of the person being divined, and the questions asked, of course. The questions asked is a big thing. It's an important thing. I'll get into that at some point. So first of all, what is the future made of? Heraclitus, or I don't know how that's pronounced in English, he would say pantarei. Everything flows. The future is a becoming. It's something that's in the course of happening, at least from our present perspective right now. And we're trying to read into that from the present. So what is the future made of? Okay, now the big answer that we have today is the future is determined by its causes. You know, there's a cause and effect relationship, and all the future that happens because of this succession of causes that create the future. So everything that happens has a cause in the past, and the reason that everything happens is because of the past things. So basically, that is the that's the view that has been used in science. So the epistemology, the epistemological method that we call science today, basically, it's an epistemology that looks at causality. So it's the main philosophy of science is that every action is causal, number one, and number two is that we can only look at the causes that are, well, perceptible. So therefore it's also rooted in a certain form of sensuality or materialism. I'm not going to get into that so much, but the idea of causality in science is that science measures causality. It measures the causal chain of events for something to happen. Now that's a really important thing, because if I was to ask you how high is the sky and expect a number in kilometers or miles that Americans would use, you know, it would be a false question for science, because, you know, there's no limit, there's no line, there's no border that says this is the sky and everything under is the earth and everything on top is the beyond. So science has to make up a definition or a postulate. So they're going to say, well, okay, we'll limit the sky to the ozone layer where the blue light is refracted and therefore makes us see the blue sky. So, okay, so then we'll measure the height of the ozone layer and then we'll say the sky is that height. But that's a false question. It's a question that has nothing to do in science. Because, well, it was an arbitrary limit that was put on. And that's the thing when it comes to epistemology. When you ask a question to which there is no answer or an unrelated answer, science cannot observe a limit to the sky because there is none. You only have to add a definition to it. So you kind of have to modify science, and you have to make up a postulate. So the idea that everything is causality is a postulate. It's not a discovery. It's not a conclusion. It's basically an idea that, okay, science works this way, so we're going to define reality this way. Science studies this, therefore the reality is what science studies. Much like the historian of psychology was once asked to determine what intelligence is. And he answered, intelligence is what is measured. So the instrument that you use to measure, or the philosophy that you use to measure something, definitely limits the something that you're measuring. Sky, or the height of the sky, is a purely cognitive, it's a purely human attribute. So why am I saying this? Well, basically, it's basically to say that the way that we conceive our reality, the way that we conceive that future is made, will determine how our divination happens. So, if everything is causality, what is divination? If the only way that future can happen, that future can exist, is by previous causes that cause an effect, and that effect causes another, and so on and so forth. So you have this present thing. So the diviner that uses causality will look at this present divinatory experience, the tarot cards, the pendulum swinging, the clairaudience, the spirit guides talking to them, etc., the images in the crystal ball. Now, all of these things in a causal scheme, the diviner will say, okay, all of these things happened in the past. Therefore, what might happen in the future based on the past is this path, that other path, and we'll be able to give out a few possibilities. Now, if the diviner is very, very certain about their readings into the causality, if they're very good at it, of course they'll say all of these things happened causally, and therefore the next logical step, the next causal thing to happen will be this and this and that. Now, if I just look at my sheet just to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Yes, of course, you have this whole idea of, that if everything is causal, then you can become a determinist, that, things only happen because they had to happen that way, and they had to happen that way because the previous causes determined it like it is. I mean, if you have a shadow, light hits an object at a certain angle, and the shadow will always be proportionate to that angle of light. If you're playing billiard, you hit a ball, you hit the white ball on the colored ball, and the colored ball's angle will always move proportionately to the angle of the white ball. It's a perfectly causal scheme. And if you see all of reality happen like that, then the idea is that the cards will tell you exactly what's going to happen because it could not have happened any other way. People say that in our brains, that we have circuits in our brains. The neurons, they will hit a certain other number of neurons in a specific circuit with a specific chemical force in a specific chemical soup, and therefore how things are happening could not have happened any other way. Divination in this case would mean, the divination could not have happened any other way, and therefore it is ultimately related in the causal scheme, and the The competent diviner only simply walks with that causal scheme and makes these things linguistically or cognitively known via the tool of divination, so to speak. Now that's really interesting because when you're into that whole hard determinism thing, when you believe that everything is going to happen, you're basically what is known as a fatalist, as Stanislas de Gaeta said in the text that I shared earlier. Basically, everything happens out of fate. There's no way of going out of it. Now, of course, indeterminism has been, of course, discovered since the late 1800s and early 1900s. So, Schrodinger's cat, who is both alive and dead in the box at the same time, and the famous double slit experiment that has, quote unquote, demonstrated indeterminism, saying that things happen that cannot be predicted, even though we know all of the causes. There is a thing that happens. There is a indeterminate thing, a thing that is undetectable by our instruments, where a light beam will behave either as a wave or as a particle, and so on and so forth. And we can't know, we can't determine that, we can't predict that, we can't even make it happen how we want. Then you have other people talked about the observer's principle, is that how we observe something determines how something is going to act, which is really, really interesting when it comes to divination, because at some point when you're giving a reading to someone, you give them more information that ultimately changes the future. I think it was the philosopher Horace M. Kellen. He said, hence, the discovery of determinism is the beginning of freedom. So once you know that something is determined, our complex cognitive abilities as humans have the ability to say no, to say I do not wish this to happen that way. This whole thing that even though something is completely determined, once we take consciousness of that determination, it completely changes the determination completely. So then you have all of these theories of free will, which I'll get into at some point. Are we really free? Well, of course, most people will say yes. Freedom is a thing, except for the hard determinists. Except for the hard determinists that say that freedom is impossible. Well, a lot of people will say yes, because consciousness, in a way, enables us to take a step back away from that determinal causal scheme in our mind, in our brain, and our thinking is no longer linear, and it kind of moves us away from that whole causally determined thing. Much like if you have a cat, why does a cat decide to sit on that chair instead of this chair? Why does the cat want to not lay down at your feet, and another day it does? Almost the exact same conditions of the exact same conditions. If a cat's brain was wired exactly the same way, wouldn't it do exactly the same way? It gets modified. Things happen. Things change all the time. And in a purely deterministic world, of course, everything would be completely predictable. There would be very little change. And that's when people talk about the existence of spontaneity. So people will say, well, the reason that human beings have freedom is because of quantum indeterminism and spontaneous events actually being a thing, that spontaneity actually exists in nature. You have this spontaneous thing that happens in our brain, and that's been measured, by the way, a neuron that just kind of pops off on its own instead of the axon of the previous neuron hitting on the dendrite, throwing the neurotransmitters on the dendrite of this neuron. Sometimes neurons pop off without having been thrown neurotransmitters at it for the electrical for the electrical event to happen, for the neuron to kind of pop off and then send its neurotransmitters to the next neuron. So basically, this whole idea that you know, the only thing that exists about future is causality, and that we're either completely determined, and that divination kind of looks into causality. Then you have this whole idea of free will. I've already touched a little bit upon it, is that a very complex cognitive system, even though it is determined, freedom kind of emerges out of it, because there is this indeterminacy that happens, and this whole feedback loop of what is known as consciousness happens, and consciousness kind of lets us take a step back away from all of these causal happenings in our brain, and gives us a choice, or at least, at the very least, the conscious feedback loop will open up other deterministic circuits in the brain, leading up to other choices. So instead of things being strictly linear, both in cognition and when you look at science, it's no longer linear. You have these kind of like, things are linear, then whoop, you need a box where you have a certain number of probabilities that could happen, and one of these probabilities will come out of that box, whatever that box is. Well, that would be the box that contains Schrodinger's cat. The cat is both dead and alive at the same time, and when you open the box, you figure out the cat wasn't dead, it was sleeping, and now it's angry because it wants a treat. It's been there too long. In any case, same thing it happens with cognition. You really can't map out the decisional process of the brain. A lot of people have tried to. A lot of people propose models, but there's no strictly deterministic value to happen. And relating to this, I think I'm going a little bit too far into the psychology module that'll happen in a later video. But it's something that my neurology teacher, when I was in psychology, he told me. He said, are we happy because our neurons are secreting serotonin? Or do neurons secrete serotonin because we are happy? He said it's, the chicken of the egg or the egg. You can't answer that. Science will never answer that. Some people, they come up and say, well, we are happy because the serotonin is being secreted. And other people will say, no, the serotonin is being secreted because it's actually just a mirror image of what is actually going on, because humans are actually mental creatures. We are virtual creatures. We are not necessarily the bodies. The bodies is just a material expression of what's going on, because what's really going on is actually something more abstract, more subtle, as the alchemists would say. So the idea that this whole causal thing going on, what I've always said when I was teaching divination is that if you are within a causal stream of divination, how did I say this again? I have the words in French, but let's find it in English. They would say, divination stops where freedom begins. And this is something very interesting, because if causality is all there is, and then you have this rare instance of human freedom that kind of pops in, well, that human freedom is completely unperceivable by causality, because it effectively doesn't exist until it spontaneously comes to be. Kind of like the unique perspective of any artistic production. Any artistic painting, sculpture, piece of music, all of that, it's something that previously did not exist, and it kind of came to be within this complex probability matrix of human neurological interaction, and then comes into this whole awesome, completely new thing, this new symbol, this new meaning that did not exist before, this creative process. Well, because it's something new, it's something spontaneous, it's something previously inexistent, in that point, in that philosophical perspective, divination cannot see it. So the diviner will say, well, look at this. You have these paths ahead of you, and if you choose this, then these consequences will happen. If you choose that, these consequences will happen. If you choose this still, these consequences will happen. But now that I have given you this divination session, I have laid out the tarot cards for you, you have information that gives you more power over the causal stream, and therefore gives you a greater free will. So, checking if I didn't forget anything. Yes, I see. I apologize for this. I hope this is not too boring as a video. I'm trying to be as entertaining as possible, I dare say. Okay, so let's go into the next one. So I've talked about causality and freedom of will, which are the two most popular ones, but there's one that really doesn't get talked about anymore. It's been quote-unquote debunked by a postulate of science, not by a discovery of science, but by a postulate of science. It is something that I call teleosity, which is studied by the philosophical branch known as teleology, and it's very often translated as finality in English, at least what I've seen. Pardon. So basically, excuse me for a second. Thank you. Therefore, it's the idea that the reason for something happening is something that exists after it. So some people will argue that the reason biologically that organisms are alive is to reproduce. Therefore, the whole meaning of life is the perpetuation of life. It's kind of like an end goal, a finality to it. The reason that the biology exists, of course, is for the perpetuation of life, and therefore it's not necessarily, yes, it can be explained in causal terms, as in at some point in the beginning of the planet there was this soup of chemicals, and it so happened that proteins formed by some sort of chemical reactions, and those proteins kind of came together and formed a cell wall, and once there was a cell wall, it was possible to have a closed system that was different from the outside system and that had interactions, and then through countless aeons, DNA formed, and so on and so forth. And but the idea is that the reason it perpetuates itself is just to perpetuate itself even more. Now, in the news lately, people talk a lot about the coronavirus. What is a corona? What is a virus? It's just like this whole shell with a few hooks to get into cells so that it can just hook itself to a cell, throw its RNA inside your cell, get the RNA to produce more viruses and explode. The only reason for a virus to exist is just to perpetuate itself. There's very little, there's very little causality behind it. I mean, where does a virus come from? Well, it comes from previous viruses that mutated in some way, and that they had different hooks, and that made a different species, and this and that. But the reason they exist, of course, is to perpetuate themselves. We could go that way with the whole idea of the Big Bang. Big philosophical question I was asked many, many years ago. Gosh, I think I'm getting old. Anyways, the big question I was asked was, why is there something instead of nothing? That's a big question. Why is there something instead of nothing? There could have been nothing, but there was something. Before there was something, there was obviously nothing, unless you believe in the eternal, the eternal timelessness of being, which is definitely a possibility. But even then, the eternal timelessness of being, why is being rather than no being? Why is there something instead of nothing? The whole reason that something exists could not have come from nothing, because it's nothing. Therefore, the only reason for something to exist, for existence to exist, is itself. In other words, telos or finality, existence exists because it is self-justified, because it is something that the reasons for existence came with existence or came after existence. Existence itself is its own goal to exist. There was no previous cause to it. Whether you, even if you're in a Christian sense and you're like, what is the previous cause to God? Christians have said, no, God is the prima causa. It's the primal cause, the first cause. There's nothing else before it. Or even if you have a more pagan mindset, if you look at the Norse, they always go back to the Ginnunga gap, and there was nothing in the gap, and there was this eternal fire and this eternal cold, and at some point, they kind of interacted, and there was no reason for them to interact before. Otherwise, there was just nothing in that gap. But something happened. It's the idea that the something happening happens of its own accord. The universe pulled itself up from its own bootstraps. It came out of nothingness. The Big Bang, there was nothing, and then it blew up, and here we are. I think it was Terence McKenna that liked to make fun of science, who said, well, scientists ask, give us one free miracle, and we will explain the rest. And so science ends up this whole causal scheme, this whole causal chain of events that happened from that one thing of which there was no cause. So was it a spontaneous cause, or was it a telosity, or was it a finality that it happened because something had to happen, or it happened for absolutely no reason? It just popped up because it was spontaneous. It was an indeterminate event, that scientists would say. So that's another idea. So how does that translate to divination? Like, what is the importance of this? Well, when you're someone who is a diviner and you have your client in front of you, and you're drawing the tarot, or you're throwing the runes, people will be saying things like, well, you have this and this lesson to learn from this situation. You have this present, which is this present situation, which is kind of like being described in the tarot. And from this, the meaning of the situations that are going on is to bring you forth towards path A, towards path B, towards path C. A lot of people say this, well, nothing happens for nothing, or God has a plan for you. There is a plan for this situation, for these things to happen to make things better. So a teleologically inclined diviner will mostly make a divination to help for the future, for the meaning of what's going on. A positive, or at least a positivist diviner who believes in telosity will tell you a whole bunch of things that you have to learn, stages that you are going to go through that are going to make you learn great things and bring you towards something so much better. And those things will basically be reasons for things happening. The divination will be centered around the final reasons, or the final situations to happen, rather than what happened before. Now that's another way that the future is constructed. Now there's still another interesting way, and excuse me for a second. Pardon moi. Synchronicity. This is an acausal principle that was coined by Carl Gustav Jung. I didn't bring the book here, but I will put a file in the group of Carl Gustav Jung's book on synchronicity. He's the first guy who talked about synchronicity. He's the guy who coined the term. And basically, synchronicity is the idea that meaning is a thing. There is such a thing as meaning. Humans did not simply invent it. They basically discovered it with their higher cognitive functions. People will talk about quantum entanglement to try to support it. It's the idea that two atoms which are different in space and time, or different places in space and time that have no causal connections to it will have similar reactions when one of them is acted upon and the other is acted upon, but there's no link between the two, but they are quantumly entangled where they kind of move together in a way. And that's the idea of synchronicities, that meaning has tangible existence. So basically, when people say, well, okay, this thing happened to you and it means this. The interpretation of dreams, you can have all of the correspondence tables that you have in magic. If you're a Thelemite, you might look into Aleister Crowley's 777. A little bit more classically inclined, you'll have Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy that have many tables that say what these things are associated with. The animals that are under the influence of Saturn, the animals that are under the influence of Mars, the flowers that are under the influence of Venus, and so on and so forth. How this number acts in reality symbolically. What 5 does, and what is the meaning behind 5, and you find out that 5 has this meaning that kind of recuperates all over throughout reality. And so this idea that things are related together by some sort of meaning is very present in divination also. And of course, divination, one could argue that divination itself is basically a synchronous event, whereas you have your cards, you have your runes, you have the images in the crystal ball, you have the tea leaves or whatnot. They are synchronous. They are, in other words, they have a relation of meaning with the actual events that are going on. And a diviner that actually looks into synchronicity, they would basically talk about the meanings of things that are happening. So, okay, so I see this card, this has a meaning of this and that situation will have a meaning in your life. Perhaps I'm a bit abstract. A friend once told me, hey, when you're doing those tarot readings, don't be so intellectual. What your client wants to hear is, what time are you going to meet that partner? Is that partner going to be handsome or cute? And is there going to be good sex? And the idea is, try to be a little bit more down to earth maybe. And of course, a diviner who will be into synchronicity will necessarily talk about these signs that you will see that will need something else. So they will say, well, if you see this sign here, it will be an indication that your couple will go well. Or if you see such and such a sign, look out for that, because it will mean that your job might have such and such result. Excuse me for a second. And now we come to yes, okay. I think I've talked a lot. I'm looking at the time. Okay, 35 minutes almost. It says 34 minutes and 2 seconds. Anyways, I will close on to this. I have some more to say, but I think I'll go into that in another video. So basically, if I'm going to sum up what I've said, you have your divinatory experience, which is a moment in time, a snapshot of reality that is looking into the future or the unknown events. And you are looking into it either via causality. Those things have happened, therefore they predispose these things from happening. The diviner will probably be very good at that. And it doesn't make them a bad diviner if they only look into causality and they don't mind the other factors. Just like if you're looking into meaning, a diviner will come up and say, well, you have a lesson to learn about relationships and they will quote Frank Sinatra's song, you know, the greatest thing you've ever learned is just to love and be loved in return. And they'll talk about the finality of what's going to happen. And because they're not into the causality, they have no idea of the events that are going on. And the events might be totally wrong, but the finality will be correct. That diviner is also good, even though they have some wrong aspects. Synchronicity, people will say to look out into signs. Well, that person might be absolutely right about the signs, but might have some symbolic discrepancies with the meaning of what is going to happen, or might be the absolute opposite. They have a very good knack at finding the meaning of the events that are going to happen, but not so much in identifying the meaningful situations. You know, they will identify one thing that's not so easy to detect, whereas there would have been a bigger sign showing more information at that. And just to make sure. Yes, that's the last thing I'd like to talk about. Remember how I talked about a little text that I had put a translation of Stanislas de Gaeta? Gaeta talks about telosity or finality. He talks about it as providence, because the end goal of something that needs to happen, some people will say, well, it's something that's inherent in reality. It's a property of reality that it goes towards such and such goal. So people will say entropy. No, entropy, the meaning of reality is that it's going to go into nothingness, so let's all be nihilistic. Or, you know, they will say that, you know, God has a plan for reality, and whatever's going to happen, it's going to bring us towards something the better. Or they will say, well, you know, God gave us so much freedom is that we have a possibility to choose the telos, choose the goal to either the annihilation of humanity or that we can work together and be our own saviors, so to speak. And so the idea that there is kind of like a divine plan to it all, whether it's a polytheistic or monotheistic. It's something that's very present also. And the diviner at that point would be reading into God's will. And that's the reason why divination is called divination. We are essentially trying to have this divine understanding of reality. It's something I think I touched about in my last video. I don't rewatch my videos, by the way. So essentially, it's this idea that we're going to have this divine omniscience, this divine way of seeing more. And this kind of makes the link towards the psychological module or the psychological video that I want to make next. It's that in as much as divination can give us ideas of the goal of reality, the goal of where we're going, and as much as it can give us clues upon the meanings of what's going on and what we need to check out to actually identify meanings, in as much as it can tell us it's going in this direction causally or that direction causally, in as much as it can tell us information to help us increase our free will and transcend the divinatory experience, divination in itself will never open up our consciousness so much that we'll know everything all at once. It's basically something that is meant to help expand our consciousness, expand our sight, kind of like goggles. I forget how that's called in English. They say une longue vue in French. A telescope will help us see much further, or a microscope will help us see much deeper, but it will never help us see the totality of things. Well, of course, divination will help us see much broader into this future, into this becoming, into this the development of the events into what's going on, whether causally, whether teleologically, whether synchronistically, and of course, whether we are free or not. Now, I'm trying to hold back on speaking more about free will because there's a lot to say about that on the psychological sense. So I think I will conclude on that. I'm suspecting that I spoke rather quickly and or that my sentences might not have been always linear and coherent. Please remember that all questions, comments, suggestions, and complaints are welcome. So feel free to write down whatever you'd like, and I'll be happy to oblige. I wish you an excellent evening.